The digital display showed 8:42 a.m. when Kendrick Robinson pulled his vehicle into the parking area outside Greenville, South Carolina's municipal courthouse. Morning sunshine stretched lengthy shadows over the pavement, and Kendrick breathed out slowly. Punctuality mattered deeply to him. As a federal prosecutor, his career depended on order and readiness. Yet today, circumstances had worked against him. This morning wasn't meant to be complex. His mission was routine, contesting a mistake in property tax calculations for the home his grandmother had bequeathed him. The municipality had inexplicably increased the taxes, and Kendrick had dedicated weeks to compiling evidence proving their error. The residence meant more than real estate to him. It represented his childhood foundation, where he discovered right from wrong beneath his grandmother's caring guidance. Wearing a deep navy suit paired with a fresh white shirt, Kendrick appeared every inch the seasoned professional he was, despite his chaotic morning. An emergency call regarding an active human trafficking investigation had caused his delay. The opposing counsel had submitted an 11th-hour motion, and Kendrick couldn't disregard it. He'd examined the filing and advised his colleagues before hurrying to court, aware he was pushing his timeline. Approaching the courthouse entrance, his phone vibrated. A quick look revealed a text from his aide at the U.S. Attorney's office. The judge in Greenville has a reputation for being harsh with tardy arrivals. Be cautious. Kendrick sighed, sliding his phone into his briefcase. He felt confident. Evidence was his strength, and he arrived well prepared. Yet something about the warning remained with him. He dismissed it as he entered the building's cool interior. The municipal courthouse differed from the federal venues where Kendrick typically worked. The walls displayed a bland tan color, the chairs worn from years of service. The atmosphere carried hints of coffee and aged documents. Despite its weathered look, the facility hummed with movement. Individuals moved back and forth, gripping bundles of paperwork, expressions marked with worry over citations, small conflicts, and various petty claims. Kendrick glanced at his timepiece. 8:50 a.m. 10 minutes remaining, just enough time to locate the proper courtroom. He traced the directional signs through a tight corridor, passing people conversing in low voices. Room 204. Judge Charles Whitman's name appeared in bronze lettering on the entrance. Kendrick straightened his necktie and walked inside. The chamber was already filling with attendees. Kendrick secured a position toward the rear and settled down, opened his file to examine his documentation. While reviewing his materials, he observed the judge making his entrance. Judge Charles Whitman, an imposing figure with silver hair and intense blue eyes, drew attention without uttering a sound. His reputation for strictness showed in how he surveyed the room, his keen stare catching everything. "All rise," the bailiff declared. The room shuffled upward. Kendrick participated, maintaining proper posture. As the judge took a position, Kendrick noted the complete quiet that ensued. Judge Whitman started announcing cases individually with methodical precision, his voice sharp and impersonal. Kendrick observed carefully. A middle-aged gentleman in business attire, arriving several minutes behind schedule, entered the room without notice. Shortly after, a young lady in informal clothing slipped inside and found a seat. Neither received even a look from the judge. Kendrick took mental notes, but concentrated on his own matter. Eventually, at 9:15 a.m., Kendrick's name was announced. He collected his folder and approached the lectern, displaying composure despite the minor tardiness. As he drew near, Judge Whitman raised his eyes, his expression growing stern. Kendrick sensed the atmosphere shift, a subtle tension absent from earlier proceedings. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," the judge stated sharply, his voice piercing the silence. "Do you consider this court's time less important than your own?" Kendrick lifted his hand slightly, palms forward, acknowledging the comment. "Your Honor, I apologize for my delay." I was handling urgent federal business. The judge interrupted him. Excuses don't justify tardiness. This court functions on discipline and respect. If you cannot follow that principle, I recommend you reconsider your priorities. Kendrick felt numerous gazes upon him. He remained composed, selecting his response thoughtfully. Your Honor, I recognize the significance of punctuality. If permitted, I'd like to present my case concerning the property tax modification. Judge Whitman gestured dismissively. We'll address that shortly. First, there's the issue of contempt. Lateness compromises the dignity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $750. The declaration hung in the air like a gavel strike. Kendrick's expression tightened slightly, but he maintained neutrality. Around him, whispers spread through the audience. Your Honor, Kendrick started, his tone controlled and steady. May I offer an explanation? The judge lifted his gavel, silencing him. You may not. Consider this instruction in respecting the court. Kendrick stepped backward, his thoughts racing. This wasn't simply about punctuality. It concerned something deeper, something many present had probably witnessed previously. He briefly glanced at the other late arrivals, none of whom had faced criticism. The inequality was obvious, and Kendrick wouldn't let it pass unchallenged. Returning to his seat, Kendrick opened his folder, but this time he focused not on the property tax papers. He started writing notes, his pen moving rapidly across the page. The judge, meanwhile, proceeded with the following case, his voice steady. Kendrick understood one thing clearly. This was no typical morning. Kendrick remained in the back row, his mind spinning with assessments and observations. The courtroom maintained its pace, but Kendrick couldn't ignore the clear disparity he'd witnessed. He replayed Judge Whitman's $750 fine, comparing it with the indifference shown to others who had arrived late. The young woman who'd entered earlier sat near the front, checking her phone, untouched by reprimand. A man in a gray jacket, now presenting his case, had obviously entered after the judge began. Yet the gavel's weight had been reserved exclusively for Kendrick. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern Kendrick recognized as clearly as the documents in his briefcase. He turned to his legal training, evaluating the situation precisely. Such a steep fine for tardiness in municipal court was excessive, even punitive. He noted the reactions of those nearby, a mixture of shock, unease, and interest. Kendrick could tell others in the room shared his thoughts, but nobody dared voice them. Next case, Judge Whitman announced. Kendrick's name resonated in the room once more. He stood, his movement calm and purposeful as he returned to the podium. The judge fixed him with the same piercing stare, as if challenging him to stumble. Your Honor, Kendrick began, I have documentation here regarding the incorrect property tax adjustment. This property has belonged to my family for generations, and these modifications don't match the city's evaluated values. He positioned the folder on the lectern, revealing carefully arranged documents and photographs. He indicated a particular page. This demonstrates the original tax evaluation, which stayed constant for 5 years. The recent adjustment, however, shows a 30% increase without adequate notice or justification. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, projecting disinterest. I'll examine it when appropriate, Mr. Robinson. However, your tardiness this morning is something we cannot ignore. Do you honestly believe that the urgency of your federal duties justifies disrespecting this court? Kendrick's composure stayed firm. Your Honor, I intend no disrespect. My delay resulted from a federal case involving human trafficking, a matter I believe we all agree demands immediate action. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone remained unchanged. Your priorities, however admirable, don't excuse violating the rules. Court procedures exist for good reason. It wasn't the words themselves that affected Kendrick. It was the unspoken tone of dismissal, the implicit message that his explanation wasn't sufficient. His professional accomplishments, his character, even his effort to honor the system, none of it held weight in this room. Kendrick took a measured breath, allowing the moment to settle. Your Honor, I understand the importance of regulations. However, I must inquire, are these regulations enforced equally for everyone in this courtroom? A wave of discomfort passed through the room. The judge stiffened, color rising in his face. Are you challenging the integrity of this court, Mr. Robinson? I'm seeking clarification, Kendrick responded, his tone level. It's crucial to ensure that fairness is maintained, not just for myself, but for everyone present. The judge's gavel struck sharply. I will not accept accusations against this court. Your fine remains. Kendrick nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Your Honor. He returned to his seat, feeling the courtroom's attention on him. He could sense quiet admiration from some and apprehension from others. This wasn't Kendrick's first encounter with bias disguised as authority, but something about this moment felt significant. The room's energy was tangible, as if everyone awaited his next move. Kendrick retrieved his phone, discreetly typing notes. He wasn't finished, not nearly. He made a quiet resolution then and there. This situation wouldn't conclude here. The courtroom continued its routine, but Kendrick's presence had already altered the atmosphere. Others recognized it too. An elderly black gentleman sitting 2 rows forward turned slightly, offering Kendrick a brief knowing look. The court clerk, her fingers dancing over the keyboard, occasionally paused, her discomfort apparent. When the session concluded, Kendrick lingered momentarily. As people departed, he observed how they carried the unspoken burden of what had occurred. A young law student in the corner scribbled intensely in her notebook, her expression showing awe and resolve. Kendrick departed the courtroom with his briefcase in hand, his thoughts already forming a strategy. This was no longer about a property tax adjustment or even the fine. This concerned something much more significant, something he couldn't overlook. As Kendrick left the courtroom, the fresh air outside provided no relief from the tension that still surrounded him. The courthouse bustled with the ordinary activities of daily proceedings, but within Kendrick's mind, a decision was taking shape. He paused momentarily on the courthouse steps, looking at his phone, his thumb lingering over his assistant's contact at the U.S. Attorney's office. No, he murmured to himself. Not yet. He stepped aside to review his notes again. The interactions he had witnessed and experienced in Judge Whitman's courtroom created a clear picture. The disparity wasn't accidental. It was systematic. Kendrick's legal instincts told him he now possessed the foundation of a much larger case, one that extended beyond property taxes or even his personal treatment. Back in his vehicle, Kendrick opened his briefcase, retrieving his badge and credentials. The federal prosecutor's emblem, embossed in gold, caught the sunlight streaming through his windshield. He decided this would be his opening move. By the time he re-entered the courtroom, most morning cases had finished. The room was quieter, though a few stragglers remained, reviewing papers or waiting their turn. Judge Whitman was examining documents, his demeanor calm but visibly weary. Kendrick walked confidently toward the bench, his badge and identification ready. As he approached the podium, the court clerk looked up, her fingers stopping mid-stroke. Judge Whitman glanced up, his irritation returning almost immediately. Mr. Robinson, the court session has ended. If you have additional business, you'll need to schedule an appointment. The judge said curtly. With respect, Your Honor, Kendrick began, his voice carrying quiet authority. I believe it's important to formally introduce myself. He held his badge up slightly, ensuring it was clearly visible to everyone present. I'm Kendrick Robinson, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've served with the Department of Justice for over a decade, specializing in cases involving human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations. The judge froze, his hands stopping over the papers he was handling. Color drained from his face as Kendrick's words registered. Around the room, the remaining spectators watched intently, their expressions mixing curiosity and anticipation. I was late this morning due to an urgent federal case requiring my immediate attention, Kendrick continued, his tone firm but respectful. And while I understand the importance of court procedures, I couldn't help but notice the disparity in how cases were handled here today. The judge's lips compressed into a thin line. Mr. Robinson, if you feel there was a procedural issue, you're welcome to file a formal complaint. I've already begun documenting the events of this morning, Kendrick replied, holding up his notebook. Not just my own treatment, but the varying responses to other late arrivals, particularly along racial lines. As an officer of the court, I'm obligated to report any patterns of bias or discrimination I encounter. Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. Are you accusing this court of misconduct, Mr. Robinson? I'm stating what I observe, Your Honor, Kendrick said calmly. As a federal prosecutor, I've devoted my career to ensuring justice is applied equally, regardless of who appears before the bench. What I witnessed today raises serious concerns. The silence in the room was complete. The court clerk glanced nervously between Kendrick and the judge, her hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. The young law student in the back corner was frantically taking notes, her eyes wide with fascination. The judge cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. This court takes such matters seriously. If you believe there was an error in judgment, I suggest addressing it through proper channels. Kendrick placed his badge and identification on the podium. I intend to, Your Honor, but I also believe this moment presents an opportunity for reflection on how we ensure that the principles of fairness and equality are upheld in every courtroom. Judge Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He had presided over this courtroom for decades, his authority rarely questioned so directly. For the first time, it seemed his confidence wavered. You may go, Mr. Robinson, the judge said, his voice quieter now. Kendrick collected the credentials and turned to leave, but not before offering one final statement. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll ensure this is addressed properly. As Kendrick walked out of the courtroom for the second time that morning, he felt the eyes of every remaining spectator on his back. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about challenging a system that too often failed to recognize its own flaws. Outside, Kendrick pulled out his phone and began typing a detailed email to the office. He included every observation, every interaction, and every instance of disparity he had witnessed. By the time he hit send, he knew this was only the beginning. The email Kendrick sent that afternoon moved faster than he anticipated. By the next morning, his phone buzzed with a call from the U.S. Attorney's Office. His supervisor, Julia Harper, a no-nonsense attorney with decades of experience, spoke with a mix of urgency and intrigue. Kendrick, I read your report, she said. If what you're describing is accurate, it's not just a one-off situation. This could indicate systemic bias. I believe it does, Kendrick replied. What happened yesterday wasn't subtle. It's part of a pattern I've seen before, and I'm certain I'm not the only one who's experienced it. Julia exhaled sharply. I'll reach out to the Judicial Review Commission. This needs to be handled delicately, but thoroughly. In the meantime, gather as much documentation as you can. If this goes public, we need to be ready. The call ended, but Kendrick's work was just beginning. He spent hours piecing together every detail from the municipal court session. He combed through public records, noting inconsistencies in fines and penalties issued by Judge Whitman. Patterns began to emerge. Fines for minor infractions were significantly higher for black defendants, while white defendants often received warnings or reduced penalties. Kendrick reached out to colleagues and community members, including attorneys who had appeared in Judge Whitman's courtroom. The responses were overwhelming. Stories of disparate treatment flooded in. Some whispered in confidence. Others offered with bold defiance. A young black woman recounted being fined heavily for a parking violation, while a white man with multiple offenses received only a small fee. Another described how the judge often interrupted black defendants, rarely allowing them to fully explain their cases. Within days, the Judicial Review Commission initiated a formal inquiry. Investigators descended on the courthouse, requesting years of case records and interviewing staff. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, proved to be a pivotal figure. Nervously, she handed over a small notebook she had kept hidden in her desk drawer for years. "These are notes I've been taking," she confessed. "Every time something didn't sit right, I wrote it down. I've been too afraid to say anything, but I can't ignore it anymore." The notes painted a damning picture. Dates, names, and instances of unequal treatment were meticulously recorded. Investigators also spoke with James Wilson, the longtime bailiff in the courtroom. He shared his observations with quiet conviction. "I've been here 15 years, Wilson said. "I've seen how the judge treats people differently, depending on who they are. I always knew it wasn't right, but I didn't think there was anything I could do." Meanwhile, the story began to leak into the local community. A young law student who had witnessed the exchange in the courtroom posted a detailed account on social media. Within hours, it gained traction, sparking outrage and a flood of similar testimonies. The headlines followed soon after. "Bias in Greenville Courtroom. Federal prosecutor challenges judge's conduct." News outlets picked up the story, and Kendrick found himself at the center of a growing storm. Calls from reporters came nonstop, but he chose to remain focused on the investigation. The mounting pressure began to take its toll on Judge Whitman. Rumors circulated that he had been summoned to multiple closed-door meetings with judicial oversight committees. Though he publicly denied any wrongdoing, privately, he began to realize the gravity of the situation. By the end of the first week, Kendrick received a call from Julia. "The findings so far are staggering," she said. "The numbers don't lie, Kendrick. Black defendants in his courtroom were fined 3 times more often than white defendants for the same infractions. It's systemic. What's the next step?" Kendrick asked. "We're taking this to the state judicial board, and Kendrick, the media is not going to let this go. Be prepared." Kendrick nodded to himself, even as a wave of exhaustion hit him. This was bigger than he had imagined, but he had no intention of backing down. The story of Kendrick's encounter with Judge Whitman had spread far beyond Greenville. By the end of the second week, national media outlets picked up the case. Headlines like "Systemic Bias Unveiled," "Federal Prosecutor Takes a Stand," dominated the news cycle. Social media hashtags, such as #EqualJusticeNow and #BiasInTheCourts, trended for days, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences of courtroom discrimination. Kendrick remained focused, working with the Judicial Review Commission to consolidate evidence. The findings were devastating. Over the past 5 years, Judge Whitman had fined black defendants an average of 300% more than white defendants for similar offenses. Late arrivals from white defendants often went unmentioned, while black defendants faced reprimands or steep fines. Even requests for leniency, such as payment plans, were disproportionately denied to minority defendants. The evidence wasn't just statistical. It was deeply human. Former defendants came forward, some publicly, others anonymously, to share their stories. A black mother recounted being fined $500 for contesting a minor zoning issue, despite presenting clear evidence that the city was at fault. A young man described how the judge had humiliated him in court, questioning his work ethic, only to dismiss a similar case from a white defendant minutes later. Local activist groups joined the fray, organizing rallies and calling for accountability. Outside the Greenville courthouse, protesters held signs reading, "Justice should be blind and end bias now." Kendrick avoided the public spectacle as much as possible, but he couldn't ignore the significance of what was unfolding. Inside the courthouse, the pressure mounted. Staff members who had worked under Judge Whitman for years began sharing their own observations. Mrs. Thompson, the clerk, became a key figure in the investigation. Her detailed notes, combined with court records, painted a comprehensive picture of bias that spanned decades. "I never thought anyone would listen," she said during one interview with investigators. "But now that it's all coming out, I can't stay silent anymore." Even James Wilson, the bailiff, spoke up publicly. In a statement to the commission, he said, "I've seen this kind of treatment for years. It's wrong, and it's long past time for something to be done." Judge Whitman, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. While he initially dismissed the accusations as misinterpretations, the mounting evidence forced him into damage control. In a rare public statement, he expressed regret for any unintentional actions that may have caused harm. The words rang hollow in the face of overwhelming proof to the contrary. Kendrick, though inundated with attention, stayed grounded. He continued his work as a federal prosecutor, knowing that his responsibilities extended beyond this case. At the same time, he couldn't ignore the messages pouring into his office. Emails, phone calls, and letters came from across the country, some offering support, others sharing similar stories of bias in other courtrooms. One particularly moving letter came from a retired attorney in Alabama. "For years I saw the same injustices you're describing, but I never spoke up. Thank you for having the courage to do what so many of us couldn't." The movement grew beyond Greenville. Other judges in South Carolina faced scrutiny as activists, and reporters began digging into court records. The state's Judicial Oversight Committee announced a broad review of municipal courts, vowing to root out systemic bias. By the end of the month, the Judicial Review Commission completed its preliminary report. The findings were damning, and the implications were clear. Judge Whitman's actions were part of a larger, deeply embedded problem. The report called for immediate reforms, including mandatory bias training for judges, regular audits of court decisions, and the establishment of independent oversight committees. The pressure became too much for Judge Whitman. Faced with the prospect of a public hearing and potential disciplinary action, he announced his resignation. In a brief statement, he said, "I believe it's in the best interest of this court and this community that I step aside." The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some viewed it as an admission of guilt, while others saw it as a necessary step toward healing. For Kendrick, it was a moment of vindication, but not celebration. The resignation was just the beginning. The real work lay ahead. As reforms began to take shape, Kendrick found himself in a new role. He was invited to speak at law schools, community forums, and legal conferences about his experience and the importance of challenging systemic bias. His story inspired young lawyers, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, to see themselves as agents of change. At one such event, a young black law student approached Kendrick after his speech. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules. It's about people. You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Kendrick smiled, humbled by the words. "The fight is just beginning, but if we all do our part, we can make the system better." 3 months after the morning that set everything in motion, the courthouse in Greenville looked markedly different. The tired beige walls were repainted, and a new welcome desk greeted visitors as they entered. Signs in multiple languages directed people to resources they hadn't known were available before: payment plans, legal aid, and procedural guides. A small but meaningful plaque had been installed near the entrance. Equal justice is everyone's right. Inside the courthouse, changes were even more pronounced. Judge Whitman was no longer presiding, having quietly left the bench following his resignation. In his place, a younger judge with a reputation for fairness and impartiality had taken over. More importantly, systemic reforms were already underway. All court personnel were now required to attend bias training, led by experts who tackled the subtle ways discrimination could seep into decision-making. Kendrick stood at the back of the newly renovated courtroom, his eyes scanning the room. He had been invited to speak to a group of local judges and lawyers about the changes that had been implemented. As he waited for his turn, he felt a mixture of pride and cautious optimism. Change had begun, but he knew there was still a long road ahead. The reforms extended far beyond Greenville. Inspired by Kendrick's actions, other communities in South Carolina, and eventually across the country, began reevaluating their own court systems. State judicial review boards implemented mandatory audits of case outcomes, with particular attention to racial and socioeconomic disparities. Oversight committees composed of legal experts, community advocates, and former defendants were established to monitor court proceedings and ensure accountability. In Kendrick's office, the momentum was palpable. His fine from that fateful morning now hung framed on his wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of why he had taken a stand. Below it was a photo from a recent event, a group of young law students who had started a civil rights clinic in his honor. Their smiles radiated hope, and Kendrick couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility toward the next generation of legal minds. In the community, the ripple effects were equally significant. James Wilson, the veteran bailiff who had served under Judge Whitman, was now leading bias training sessions for court officers. At one of the sessions, he addressed a room filled with new hires. "Our job isn't just to keep order," he said. "It's to ensure that everyone who steps into this room is treated with dignity. If you see something wrong, you speak up. Silence is complicity." Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk whose records had been instrumental in the investigation, had been promoted to oversee a new program focused on ethical court practices. She worked tirelessly, mentoring younger clerks and ensuring that the mistakes of the past wouldn't repeat themselves. Kendrick's influence extended beyond the legal community. He began teaching a seminar at a nearby law school, focusing on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary. His students, many of whom were inspired by his story, often stayed after class to ask how they could make a difference. One afternoon, a student approached him with a notebook filled with ideas for reform. "What do you think is the most important thing we can do to make the system fairer?" she asked. Kendrick thought for a moment before responding. "Listen to each other, to the people who come through our courts, and to those who are too afraid to speak up. Listening is where real change begins." The changes weren't without resistance. Some judges and attorneys bristled at the new oversight measures, claiming they undermined their authority. But the evidence was undeniable. Within a year, the data showed a significant decrease in racial disparities in fines and sentences in Greenville's municipal court. Payment plans were approved more often, and defendants reported feeling treated with more respect. For Kendrick, the most rewarding moments came from the people who approached him to share their stories. An elderly black man who had been in the courtroom that morning months ago returned to the courthouse to thank him. "I've been coming here for 40 years, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen so much injustice, but I never thought I'd see the day when someone finally said enough. Thank you for giving us hope." One morning, Kendrick received a letter in his office. It was from a young public defender in Chicago who had read about his story and been inspired to start her own investigation into biases in her local courts. The letter ended with a simple but powerful line. "Your stand reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Kendrick read the letter twice before placing it in a folder labeled Impact He leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the moment settle. It wasn't about him. It never had been. This was about the countless voices that had been silenced or ignored for too long. Voices that were finally being heard. Months later, Kendrick walked back into the courthouse where it had all begun. He wasn't there for a case or an investigation. He had been invited to speak at the unveiling of a new judicial ethics center named in part after his efforts. As he stepped to the podium, he looked out at the crowd. Judges, lawyers, clerks, and community members filled the room, their faces a mix of anticipation and gratitude. Justice isn't just about laws, Kendrick began. It's about how we treat the people who come into our courtrooms. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. And it's about ensuring that every person, no matter who they are, knows that they matter. The applause was thunderous, but Kendrick's focus was on the faces in the crowd. He saw hope, determination, and the beginnings of real change. And he knew that while the work was far from over, this was a step in the right direction.